Hello, everybody. Welcome to Free Kiwis. Today we have Brandon McMurtrie, who is a third-year PhD student in psychology at Massey and someone who's very active on Twitter or X and has also written for magazines like Quillette. So welcome to the show, Brandon.
Cool. Thanks for having me. It's nice to be here.
Can you just tell us actually first, what's the subject of your psychology PhD?
So I'm researching affective polarization, which is essentially political polarization as measured through like the emotions people have towards their outgroup. So it's like the level of antipathy they hold towards those of their opposing outgroups. That's primarily measured between the political left and right all over the world, but it's a huge literature in America specifically between left and right, or Republicans and Democrats, depending on what labels each study uses. But there's a lot of literature essentially asserting that political polarization has very real harms for people in terms of loss of social support. There's a lot of literature asserting that being politically polarized, being highly emotionally reactive to the sort of political realm can act as like a socio-political stressor, which exacerbates even physiological stress and allostatic load. And there's a assertion that it negatively impacts people's physical health
Probably
in a very real.
negatively impacts the health of the democracy as well, which I think James and I have been concerned about. I'm aware of
Yeah,
some of this literature. Well, in particular, the Pew Research studies that show Democrat and Republican voters getting further and further apart over
yeah,
successive years and what they think of one another and whether they'd be happy to have their children marry one another and so on. Uh,
exactly.
and their political
That's
views is,
exactly what I'm researching. Yeah,
yeah.
that social distance is one measure of effective polarization that you mentioned there, which is um, essentially how much social distance different partisans want from each other, whether they would be willing for their loved one to marry or date an opponent, whether they would want to share a neighborhood or have a neighbor who is a political opponent, etc. And long ANES studies show that since about the 1970s, yeah, there's been a real strong affective divergence between the parties in America. And it's primarily driven by, you can actually see a really clear graph where the in-group affinity, or the in-group
Yep.
positive affect, is stable over the past 50, 60 years, but the out-group hate just
It's
nosedives, or
gone.
the hate climbs. Yeah,
Hate crimes, and
yeah,
yeah, tolerance nosedives.
yeah,
I remember seeing some images from these Pew studies that Michael mentioned, where it's based. I think they actually look at the left and the right's political positions, and it starts off being basically overlapping, like an overlapping sort of red mountain and a blue mountain,
mm,
which is kind of a distribution. And then
mm,
over time, and these mountains start to sort of separate out. And now we're
yeah,
apparently in a situation where there's this huge gulf in the center, which is of course really
yeah,
dangerous because it used to be the case that politicians would sort of tack to the center because they want to attract the median voter, and that led to a
yeah,
certain moderation. And now it's almost like, I think as a Republican politician said, the only thing in the middle of the road is roadkill. Like if you do move into the middle of the road, there are no voters there, and so there's all these
yeah,
incentives to actually become more extreme.
yeah. Yeah, and it's an incredibly complex, like all these things we're touching on, there's so many things under the surface, whether you're talking about elite polarization or mass polarization, or whether you're talking about effective polarization or ideological polarization. So you can measure it either in terms of the extremity on average of the positions that each group believes, and if their beliefs are growing further apart, the average
Yep.
issue positions, it's ideological, or you can measure it in terms of emotional or affective polarization.
In
And
other
there's a
words, what
long
they think
debate,
of one another, is that right?
yeah, what they think of one another, how they feel towards one another. And there's actually a long debate in the early 2000s where different researchers went back and forth. I think it was Abramowitz and Fiorina and a number of other authors argued about the extent of polarization. And it was because they were measuring it differently. So ideological polarization, strangely, appeared, at least for the longest time, to not be growing significantly. Like the average
Mm.
issue positions of Democrats and Republicans, there's still considerable overlap.
When was that time span?
Early, from like the late 80s to early 2000s, kind of.
Right. I mean,
Eh,
I guess I'd be interested in what it was like now. Also, what they were
yeah,
actually measuring, because
yeah,
if you're measuring views on, say, racial equality or
mm,
homosexual rights and things like that,
mm,
I wouldn't be surprised if there isn't that much polarization.
yeah,
But what I'd be more interested in is attitudes to
to democratic institutions, and whether that's polarized, because and we'll come to this with your left-wing authoritarianism stuff, because it seems to me that that's the thing that's started to drive people apart, is the sense that the institutions have been captured by, well, essentially the left, from people who actually might have been previously on the left themselves, but who have found the ground to have moved so far that they no longer see themselves that way.
Yeah, because what Elon Musk and people are doing in the States, which we both are quite worried about and think is pretty extreme. I mean, the reason it's gone so far, the reason he's just trying to clear out whole departments and stuff, I don't like it, but I'm trying to say that I think I understand why it's gotten to that extent. It's gotten to that extent because people perceive these, public service departments as being kind of completely against them or completely one-sided, and they think of the media in the same way. And there is some evidence that's very skewed in the media. I still don't think it's justified to do what Musk is doing, but that does, I think, explain it.
Yeah, yeah, it's a tough one because I'm susceptible to a lot of like the arguments and the rationale behind some of the changes going on, but the speed and sort of carelessness with which they're hoeing into the task at hand is a little scary. But it is interesting to think that for a long time, average ideological positions, and even to a certain extent, attitudes towards institutions, there was a significant overlap between the groups, while there was actually also a very pronounced affective gap between the groups. So although, what did they call it? Oh, they had a really cute title to sort of sum it up, that in general, on average, people tend to agree about the issues, but they hate each other more than ever. Like most citizens do indeed remain centrists and they share views with their opponents, but for some reason they hate them more than they ever have, despite the fact that the overlap is.
So is that something to do with like the way people look or like the music? Because if it's not their political opinions, like what is it about them that people focus on or latch onto when they hate each other?
Could be straightforward tribal affiliation. Like you
is,
belong to a different tribe.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. So it's like, what are the markers of the tribalism?
Well, it could be just I'm a Democrat voter and you're a Republican voter, and that's enough.
Yeah, even though their views are actually similar. Yeah.
I mean, this is all tied in together. There's definitely ideological polarization, especially now going on.
Yeah.
But it appears a lot of times to be just a social, emotional process. Oh, uncivil agreement is what they called it. The rise of uncivil agreement, which is everyone agrees, but they're all uncivil towards each other. They don't obviously all agree, but on average, the average uninformed citizen, whether on the left or right, actually agrees with much more than they think, but they hate each other more than ever. It's this uncivil agreement that they have. And you could put that down to change in the information environment. Just the proliferation of electronic media into everyone's lives means that these identities, these tribal identities, because of the incentives of algorithmic personalization and what catches people's attention online, we're constantly getting cued with this stuff. And then the elites realize they can use this access into our lives to proliferate campaigning and sort of motivate their bases with emotional language. And so despite the fact that citizens in general maybe not becoming more extreme, there's something about the information environment that's just driving social tribalism, driving those.
Well, we've seen some of that in the work of Jonathan Haidt and others, looking at the dynamics of social media and the way that tends to polarize people. I'd argue that actually probably in the last few years, and I think this has been around for a long time, but I think it's really metastasized in the last few years, is a fundamental disagreement about the nature of reality seeping into the political level. And what I mean by that is the politicization of postmodern ideas underpinning a lot of the authoritarian left's positions on things, which is kind of curious because at root, postmodernism is highly relativist, and yet they take incredibly fixed positions on specific issues. But the disagreement is really whether, there is an objective reality or not, which is a pretty fundamental disagreement.
Yeah, that dogmatism is something that comes up a lot in the authoritarianism stuff, which we can talk about later. But I think actually, although in the beginning ideological polarization maybe wasn't occurring to a great degree, once that emotional polarization happens, and there's an environment of high threat and high sort of like tribalism in the culture, that triggers intragroup processes of like purity spirals and various other processes that do then in turn actually cause the groups to diverge, not only in their affects towards one another, but they actually then start to diverge in terms of their actual positions, and they become extreme. So you get the left undergoing purity spirals and ending up way far left, and then you have the corresponding rightward shift among the right and stuff. So I think although it started with emotional or affective polarization, that then triggered all these other processes where now ideological polarization is likely at a peak as well.
It's very interesting to reflect on that with the universities in the last few years, and also the rise of the far right, I suppose, which I think I was coming a bit later. But yeah, because I guess in my experience, the universities, well, I was at Stanford when I was doing my PhD. This is before like 2013. And I thought of it as like, there wasn't really any problems with people being canceled as far as I could perceive. It was mainly left liberal, but it wasn't really an issue. And then when I first came to Vic, it was okay for a few years. And then it was really just in the last sort of, 7 or 8 years, so since about 2017, that I thought things just really went crazy within the universities. And David Rosado has all these beautiful charts of these prejudice denoting terms, which just explode, both in the mainstream media, but also in academic abstracts in that period. And so are you trying to say that that's probably explained by there was first this period when within the universities, it's very much, I definitely got that through this whole period, that there was kind of dislike for people on the right. Like I definitely heard like little comments the whole way through of like people on the right are stupid, etc. Conservatives are dumb. But the people on the left liberal people still weren't that extreme. Like they still weren't saying that the police should be abolished and like all the institutions should be torn down, which they actually, like, a lot of them started to say in 2020, 2021. And then later you have this shift where the positions become really extreme, not among everybody, of course, but among the sort of leading vanguard. And then everybody else just kind of played along and didn't really say anything about it.
Well, now we have politicians like Tamitha Paul saying that kind of thing in our parliament. Police ought to be abolished.
Right. Yeah. And then there's this sort of reactive polarization, I guess, on the right. Although I do think that in the States there's like the mainstream right. It's so mainstream now that it has the White House. Whereas in New Zealand, I don't think that the right wing backlash has been that significant. Just because
I agree,
but
we may be behind them. That's something to always bear in mind. Our social trends tend to follow American ones at a bit of a delay. And Brandon, I'd be interested in exploring what you mean by left and right, because it's a dichotomy that I've started to really question, and I say that as somebody who kind of leans libertarian. I mean, I'm a classical liberal. I'm not an extreme libertarian, but I like the idea of open economy, open society, and, to the extent that we can accommodate, open borders as well. I recognize the limits on that, but as an ideal, I'd like to see people be able to go where they want, live where they want, work where they want, and so on. How is that idea right wing? Because people call it right wing, and you could say, well, the capitalist part of it is, but then people also say that fascists are right wing, and our fascists are right wing. How can I be right wing when I disagree with fascists about everything?
Oh, I mean, this is a topic I feel like I've somehow gotten less clear on and less informed on as time goes by. The categories just become more and more confused in my head. That's why I tend to use the term leftists and rightists rather than like liberals and conservatives, because both groups have gone through, first of all, so many splits over the years, but they've also changed positions. Like if you read Christopher Lasch in The True and Only Heaven, he gives a history of progressivism. He talks about how in the original days of sort of liberalization of the economy, industrialization, and the belief in markets and stuff, it was the conservatives who were against free market economics and all that sort of stuff. Whereas now the free market
I'd say some still are.
Yeah, some still, and that's what I mean.
There's nationalistic conservatism that wants to have trade protection and that kind of thing.
Well, they're coming back, aren't they?
Yeah, in a big way.
Stuff, right? But in general, if you talk about sort of the
like when I was growing up at university, that was a standard thing that people on the right were in favor of free markets, at least in Canada, the UK, like definitely the States.
Yeah. Whereas when that was initially happening, the conservatives or people on the right were worried about the degrading effect that the free market would have on culture, so they were against it. Once the benefits of the free market came and the issues with that became apparent, then the left turned on it in a lot of ways, or the left became became more skeptical of free markets, and then the right became more supportive of free markets in general. But again, as you say, this stuff's so messy.
Again, I'd have to ask you whether you think the left and right, the terms left and right, help us much, because I mean, what is emblematic of the left and emblematic of the right? What doesn't change about those two things? Because if there's nothing, then
yeah.
Not necessarily the case that they're sort of empty categories are meaningless if there's no stable identifier, right? Because they could just be sort of clusters of beliefs or traits.
Yeah,
So
they
you really
could.
just someone must have done some kind of factor analysis, right? It might just be that like, even though the sort of paleoconservative beliefs and tradition and stuff are different from the free market beliefs, it may just be that those people are more strongly associated, or those ideas are more closely associated than like belief in state control of the economy. You know what I mean? So they're just kind of like bedfellows by chance, but they are sort of more closely aligned
Yeah.
in fact than other beliefs.
I guess I mean, I kind of hold with the political compass idea that we need at least two axes,
Yeah.
and that it's better to kind of conceptualize those axes in terms of uh, liberty to authoritarian, libertarian to authoritarian, shall we say.
Mhm.
So you can have a libertarian attitude to the economy, which is free markets, or an authoritarian attitude, which is more state control. And similarly, you can have the same continuum with respect to social issues.
Yeah. I think that's the best. That's sort of the best way to think about it, in my opinion. But when I say left and right, you're sort of just using a very coarse sort of measure of the general sort of groups as they manifest. Like in general, people on the left are about social justice and more friendly to state control of certain things. On the right, they're a bit sort of have a bit more of a libertarian sort of. But again, as we're seeing with the current American government, the sort of the attitude to freedom might not be necessarily inherently right wing. Yeah, you got to have those
And
double
even on the social
axes.
justice question, I mean, 50 years ago, social justice was characterized by egalitarianism and trying to collapse distinctions between different social groups. So, color blindness and with respect to race, and treating women in much the same way as we treat men, and so it's collapsing distinctions. Whereas now, the social justice movement seems to want to reinforce distinctions and say, if you're such and such an ethnicity, you need different treatment than if you're, you see what I'm saying?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And as I say, I kind of keep using these terms coarsely because they allow us hopefully to convey sort of a meaning that we all sort of understand, but it all shifts and changes so quickly that the whole left-right political spectrum thing becomes messy so quickly that the longer you think about it, it becomes really hard to even pin yourself down on a political scale. Like if people ask me where I am, I'm like, God, I don't even know anymore. I don't know.
Well, I would
You'd
kind of
have to ask
defend
me
the
about
left
it.
and right wing axis because I think that people sort of tend to know what you mean. It's a bit like the term woke, like it's very hard to pin down exactly what you mean, but people sort of know.
Exactly.
And again, I
Yeah.
think we can be too obsessive about definitions. We can be too sort of Socratic or Platonic about definitions and try and like identify one feature that runs through all these cases of right wing people or left wing people. But really, I think often in life we're dealing with sort of clusters of attributes.
I think you're right,
we tend to know like the kind of thing you mean.
I think you're right, but I still think that where that argument breaks down is if there's actually more than one continuum at work. So my argument is that there's always been two axes, at least. If we did a factor analysis, would be measuring two traits, which is degree of liberalism or conservatism in respect of economics, and degree of liberalism or conservatism in respect to social issues. Now, throughout the second half of the 20th century, it so happened that a diagonal on those two axes lined up with left versus right, such that people were conservative socially and liberal economically, and we called that right wing, and other people were more in favor of authoritarian economics and liberal social views.
Let's say since the Second World War, maybe.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. But I think that dichotomy is now shattered,
and more so since the 80s. I mean, really, that dichotomy really became pronounced in the 80s.
I think that's right.
Even in the 70s, you go back to Muldoon, you know.
Oh yeah, I mean, he was an agrarian socialist.
Yeah. There's actually a really interesting article on this by Thomas Costello, who actually developed the who ran the largest and probably best study on left-wing authoritarianism. He also has a paper called Thinking Outside the Ballot Box, where they essentially assert that the traditional left-right spectrum does oversimplify political preferences and is just not really fit for purpose. And they use a whole bunch of different methods for trying to classify political beliefs in a much more sort of specific taxonomy. Right. But
yeah, okay. Well,
I couldn't recite it off the top of my head anymore. Actually,
let's say we'll put the link at the bottom of the video. But let's talk about. We'll go back to mental health. Another thing we want to talk about. But let's talk about this left wing and right wing authoritarianism, because so I read an article in Quadrant, which I'll try and find a link to, a while back. And my understanding of the research is that this goes back quite a long way, like maybe even to the 1950s. And it's a classic case, it seems to me, of how sort of left-wing dominance of academia leads to them sort of seeing the world in a slightly skewed way, even if they're actually quite well-intentioned and they're trying to do a good job. And what seems to have happened with the literature on authoritarianism is that they just devised a lot of surveys asking people things like, do you respect the authority of priests? Do you respect the authority of military leaders? And then they got all these results like, oh, these people are incredibly right-wing and authoritarian, and these two things seem to go closely together. And then only recently have social scientists started to say, oh, wait, what if we just change these questions a little bit? And we asked, about typical left-wing sources of authority, so trade unionists and I don't know, teachers, revolutionary leaders, journalists, right? And then they found that actually the differences weren't that great.
Yeah, so it did start, I believe Adorno started researching in this area in like the 30s and 40s, but he published his F scale, which was the fascism scale, in the 50s, I think. And the whole project was, rather than studying authoritarianism as it pertains to like government and institutions and that sort of stuff, they conceived of it as a personality construct. So it can vary between person to person. Someone can be more or less authoritarian in terms of their disposition than someone else. So they conceived of it as something within a person, like a personality trait. And they sought to be able to measure this because they'd obviously just gone through the war and seen a bunch of fascist regimes and stuff. And they thought that understanding how authoritarianism manifests in the personality of the populace could give insight into why people support and take part in sort of like authoritarian regimes.
Right.
From the beginning, sorry, you go.
I'm just wondering if that idea has persisted. So, I mean, obviously the study of personality has evolved since then, and we have things like the big 5 personality traits with, I think they've each got 2 sub-traits that break in different ways. Can we analyze authoritarianism in terms of those kinds of personality inventories?
You could probably look at correlations between them.
Do you know of any research in that regard?
Off the top of my head, I can't think of. I mean, you'd have to say like agreeableness is negatively associated with authoritarianism, and sort of like you can intuit.
Would you? I mean, I wonder about that, because we observe, for instance, that women are more likely to be left-wing authoritarian than men, and there's plenty of evidence of that out of studies in universities of what
you're right, actually,
what kinds of views we'd expect to tolerate, or people would be willing to tolerate, and women are less tolerant of divergence of opinion amongst academics, and yet women, by and large, are more agreeable, or at the average, are more agreeable.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I'm actually, because I have such issues with the whole body of literature itself, I spend a lot of my time critiquing it rather than really keeping up to date on the results, because I think most of the results are bunk anyway.
Right. I mean, garbage in, garbage out, I guess.
Yeah, from the beginning, it was a political ideological project to find. There's a good article. I'll send you all links for things I cite here. There's a good article by Jesse Smith called "Old and New Wineskins," where he first lays out the issues with the authoritarianism literature, and then shows how the same thing is being replicated in the Christian nationalism literature. But as it pertains to authoritarianism, essentially from the beginning, it was a project that stacked the deck and ensured that authoritarianism would be found only among right-wing people. By asking questions that aren't even strictly, if you read a lot of them, you'd look at a question and think, that's not even asking about authoritarianism. It's essentially asking, are you conservative? And if you answer highly to that, then you get rated, that gets scored as an authoritarian response.
Right.
And so it ensures that authoritarianism gets associated with conservatism, and it inflates the associations and the results by confounding the two constructs together. And it just ensures that, yeah, one group comes out of it looking very favorable, one group comes out of it looking very authoritarian. But after the F scale by Adorno got critiqued a lot. But I think in the 80s, Altemeyer created the right-wing authoritarianism scale. And that became the default scale for measuring authoritarianism. And it essentially had all the same issues. Like there's questions in there. There's one question asking what people think about nudist camps or nudist colonies. And if you were to respond and say, I think they're probably a little bit immoral, that would be coded as a right-wing authoritarian response. So they basically just ask people their personal moral opinions on a particular lifestyle without asking whether they would enforce laws that shut those people down or any sort of authoritarian content. They just ask your preferences, your moral appraisals of a given lifestyle. And if you don't appraise the correct lifestyle as the most moral, then you get rated as authoritarian, despite the fact that you haven't actually endorsed any sort of authoritarian sort of punitive behavior.
Right. And it's an interesting example, the nudism one, because in the 1930s, there were a lot of fascist or at least Nazi movements that quite liked naturism. They'd go for naked hikes in the German countryside. It was quite embraced by the Nazis. Yeah. Yeah.
I had no idea. That's hilarious.
Yeah. Look up the history of naturism in Germany and you'll certainly find that.
That's hilarious. But yeah, so there's all these questions in there that essentially just ask, are you conservative? There are some that are good, that ask about authoritarian content, like our country desperately needs a mighty leader who will do what has to be done and destroy the radical new ways and sinfulness that is ruining us. It's a reasonable authoritarian sort of sentiment they're measuring. But then they ask other things that just are really just personal worldview, moral appraisals. And what it does is it conflates the correlation between the scale and conservatism, because conservatism is partly getting measured in the authoritarianism scale. And then they'll do things like look at the prevalence of authoritarianism in the population, but they would use the right-wing authoritarianism scale. And so lo and behold, would you believe it, they find that right-wingers are more authoritarian. But it's just because they used a right-wing measure of authoritarianism in the population. So it was a very biased sort of.
I wonder if there's something in a distinction between authoritarianism that is about kind of strongman leaders and needing, authority figures as such, and an authoritarianism that is more group conformist driven.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if that might be a kind of good way of describing the difference between right and left-wing authoritarianism.
Yeah, so in creating the left-wing authoritarianism scale, Costello ran a large paper. So basically the fundamental aspects of authoritarianism are thought to be submission, like a desire to submit to your group's established norms and authorities. Aggression, which is a desire to aggress against those who violate your group's norms or don't obey your group's authorities. And then a kind of dogmatic conventionalism. Whatever conventions your group happens to have, whether they be right-wing or left-wing, that dogmatism is in the third aspect of authoritarianism. Mm-hmm. So in creating a left-wing scale, Costello et al. Basically just used those dimensions and created a bunch of items that measured authoritarianism as manifested by or for a left-wing political project. And it's actually very interesting, some of the items. Like I'll if I can find some, I'll read you the items. But yeah, it's a very good scale. And they found that their left-wing authoritarianism scale correlated with things like endorsing political violence, dogmatism, dark triad traits, in all the same ways that that right-wing authoritarianism did.
Right.
So it seems that there's some sort of a shared core underlying the two. It's just that authoritarianism gets filtered through whatever political prism, whatever political project you happen to be endorsing.
That's interesting. So that sort of goes against what Michael was suggesting, right? You're sort of saying that the right wing and the left wing authoritarians are kind of the same. Whereas
Similar,
Michael was suggesting, and I agree with him actually, there are reasons for thinking that actually left-wing authoritarians might be different in the way they go about it, because it does seem that they tend to be more sort of social rather than individualistic, and you might think that
Mhm.
they have like a more female style of how to deal with conflict. It's this sort of passive aggression or indirect aggression rather than sort of direct personal violence, which you think might be more
Yeah,
male and more associated with the right. But these are just sort
although
of
there's a
prejudices on my
It's
account. I just
what I'm suggesting is that
yeah.
it depends on what the object of submission is. In other words,
yeah,
to what object are people submitting? And when I think of, traditional fascism, you might think of Carl Schmitt's thought, the Nazi political theorist who was basically saying the leader embodies the state. And so it's the leader to whom we're submitting. And
mhm,
for example, the Wehrmacht, the German army during the Nazi era, did not swear allegiance to Germany. They swore allegiance to Adolf Hitler.
mhm,
So everybody was orienting directly to the leader as the person they bow down to. Whereas my
mhm.
contention is that on the left, it's not so much about having a leader. It's about having a kind of shared set of doctrines and beliefs that everybody has to sign up to. And that's where you get your
Yeah.
purity spiral thing.
But the left still has leaders, and they still have hierarchies of
It
yeah,
does, but
hierarchies to which they submit.
like when people what are people submitting? It seems to me that those leaders are. I mean, every human group has its leaders, but
Yeah.
are the leaders being set up as the gods, or are
Yeah.
the values and the beliefs being set up as the gods?
One of the reasons I think we all probably have an interest in this is because of what's been going on in the universities. And my own experience of the kind of authoritarianism which has come out of the universities and has also been on
Mm,
social media is that it's incredibly kind of diffuse and diffused. So it's not
mm,
sort of one powerful leader. Sometimes it's in the university hierarchy as well, and that can be a problem
mm,
for people's careers. But sometimes it's just sort of like all over the place, all these groups of students, not all the students, but it's not like they have a rigid formal hierarchy. It's more
yeah.
like they all see themselves as representations or representatives of the group and of common norms,
Yeah.
right? And often
Yeah.
it seems crazy to me because they're assuming that these very sort of narrow norms that they have are something that everyone's consented to. That's another problem.
Mhm,
The point is just that it's almost like an egalitarian form of authoritarianism.
yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. Yeah.
And that may be
Yeah.
different from, I guess, right wing authoritarianism, which does tend to be like I'm the Duce or I'm the Führer, and then there's sort of sub leaders, and they're also
Yeah.
highly authoritarian.
And that's in like very defined and sort of conventional authoritarian regimes. But remember, when we're measuring this as sort of like an attitudinal personality dimension. So very often we're not talking about a particular leader, we're just talking about particular conventions, like should you submit to established authority
Mm-hmm.
networks of beliefs and conventions and stuff like that. So it's not so much in the context of a specific regime and leader. It's more of an attitude towards the way people should behave in society. Should they, in general, um, follow the leader and aggress against those who, or follow the leaders who set the sort of conventions for the group? Um, yeah, but what you were
Yeah.
saying about sort of the female style of disagreement, maybe changing the way left-wing authoritarianism is manifested, is there's actually a long history of left-wing authoritarian violence. I mean, hundreds of bombs were mailed in the 60s by left-wing extremists. We see
Assuming you
riots.
think, communists are left wing,
Yeah, I think that's fair though. I mean,
Yeah,
they started having
probably.
these
which
very
I,
egalitarian ideas, right? But it's true. Like he's right that we're forgetting like Pol Pot and Mao and all that. Well,
Baader Meinhof
some
Brigade.
aspects of what
Yeah.
happened under Mao were sort of bottom up, like the Cultural Revolution. But it's obviously the case that there are communist regimes like North Korea today, where it's extremely
mm,
authoritarian in what I've just been calling right wing in a right wing way.
They
yeah,
It's
have the
very
dear leader. Yeah.
it's very
yeah,
hierarchical, and there's kind of like a god king at the top of the hierarchy.
yeah,
Um, us just move on because we'll stick sort of with the universities because you've also written an article for Quillette called Identity Satiation, but it's really about sort of mental health and how we think about mental health.
yeah,
Also a little
yeah,
bit about gender, but it's from a sort of
yeah,
psychological, the perspective of psychological science. And I
yeah,
think your main claim there is basically that we're all assuming nowadays that if we talk about mental health, things will get better. Our mental health will get better. We're told this all the time,
mhm,
right? So men are
mhm,
especially are told to open up, and I'm actually
mhm,
part of this. I go to a men's group and we talk about our emotions and things, and part of this
yeah,
idea is that if we talk more about these things, it's going to be better. And your
yeah,
article really questions that, and I think in a very healthy way. So tell us more about
yeah.
that.
Yeah, first I'll have to say I'm actually a part of this too. I won't name the group because I'm just beginning to be associated with them, do some work with them. But I'm part of a group that sort of advocates for certain sectors of male sort of male social life to open up to talking about their feelings more. But I think, like anything, the dose makes the poison. And for certain groups who are already talking about their feelings a lot and have no problem with this, encouraging them to do so more can go full circle and actually become harmful. And that's sort of my thinking on that, is that it can be good, but it can also be iatrogenic in the wrong context. And other people have given a much better treatment of this issue than me, like Abigail Schreier in Bad Therapy, Jonathan Haidt. There's even a book in the early 2000s called The Dangerous Rise of Therapeutic Education. It's been on the radar for a long time. But I just noticed a few concepts that I'd actually been learning about in various courses at university that kind of shed a little light on this. So people are confused about the fact that the paradoxical phenomenon that we talk a lot about mental health. We're all engaging in therapy and self-care and various forms of checking in on ourselves all the time. But we seem to be more unwell than we ever have been, or young people especially, despite the fact that they're therapized at every turn, seem to be more confused and more unwell than they ever were. And it seems like something of a paradox. It doesn't totally make sense. But there are a
Unless the
few things I
therapy is
learned.
itself doing harm.
Exactly. And so there's a few concepts from psychology that I noticed kind of related to this. The first is semantic satiation, which is the phenomenon whereby you repeat a word again and again. I used to do this as a kid while I was riding my bike. For some reason, I just noticed it one day, that if you repeat a word again and again for a sustained length of time, you have this strange sensation whereby the word loses all meaning. You forget where it begins and ends. It sort of becomes
It
just a
becomes
sound.
alienated from its meaning somehow.
Yeah, and this is studied, this is often called inhibition, fatigue, lapse of meaning, adaptation, stimulus satiation,
Yep.
or semantic satiation. And I thought that was interesting when you combine that with the knowledge that compulsive staring, it doesn't only happen with words, it happens if you take people into a lab and have them stare at an object compulsively and really inspect it for a sustained amount of time, their recollection of that object and their understanding of that object seems to wane as well. They seem to sort of they get this paradoxical confusion concerning the object. OCD studies on the behaviors of OCD have found something called ironic uncertainty, whereby if you check something again and again, you actually become less certain of the state of that object. So people, if you can bring them into the lab and have them check again and again that something's in their pocket, or check something, after repeated checkings of that thing, they are paradoxically more uncertain of the state of it.
I wonder if it's because you start to obsess about the details of something to the extent that it becomes dissociated from its category. What I mean by that is that the purpose of a category, or the purpose of categories, is to simplify our understanding of the world in a way that makes it tractable. We can't look at all objects as being unique. We have to class things into categories according to their utility and their affordances for it, as J.J. Gibson would have put it. So, we have cups and chairs and people and dogs, and they have characteristics in common, but the exemplars also differ. And so the category is a way of organizing the information so that the important distinctions are made between categories, and kind of the details are collapsed within the category so you don't have to worry about them. But if you perseverate on an object or a word or whatever enough, then it's perhaps you're focusing on the details, and then you start to see it more for what it is rather than an exemplar of its category.
And you can't see the wood for the tree.
That's a very good way of putting it.
That may be. I tend to think it's probably something to do with the refractory period of neurons and the depletion of like neurotransmitters.
Right. I mean, that's a neurophysiological explanation of possibly the same thing.
Well, wait, say more about that. I didn't really understand that.
So once a neuron fires, there's a refractory period whereby it becomes harder to fire. The threshold to stimulate that neuron again becomes higher. It becomes harder to fire again. So when you repeatedly check something or repeat a word again and again and again, and you're firing those neurons that contain, or that system of neurons that contain that information, the refractory period becomes such that it becomes harder for that concept to then be triggered in the brain, just purely from a neurophysiological.
You get it with perceptual
perspective.
after effects, like color after effects. If you stare at a green patch and then a white wall, you'll see red, because
all that sort of stuff.
red and green exist in opposition in the primary visual cortex. You get it with orientation. If you look at lines that are slanted to the left for a long time, and then look at vertical lines that'll appear slanted to the right. There's a whole lot of things like that. Motion after effects, the waterfall effect, when you stare at a waterfall and then the rocks next to it, the rock seems to be flowing upwards. Yeah.
So there's a couple more things, and this is how I get to the state of mental health today. There's another phenomenon called mirror gazing, which they can actually use in the lab to cause sensations of depersonalization, derealization, where they have people stare into their own eyes in a mirror for an extended period of time. And that pretty reliably triggers this depersonalization, derealization symptoms, whereby people they fail to recognize their own face. They start thinking that the face in the mirror isn't theirs, or that it's changing. It doesn't look like them anymore. They start to almost not recognize themselves or feel like they're not real. And this is similar to what happens in Buddhist meditation. There are a whole bunch of Buddhist practices that are actually designed to cause this identity loss, the sense that that the universe isn't real, that I'm,
right, so that you don't exist. I mean, that's like classical Buddhist doctrine, right? This is the doctrine of anatta, no soul, right? The Buddha actually says this, that there's no such thing as a soul. And I've actually done various sorts of meditation which sort of encourage you to think that way. I mean, they don't tell you per se what it's meant to be doing. You're meant to discover it yourself, but that's kind of that's kind of what you're supposed to arrive at. This, well, realization, as Buddhists would put it. Other people would say sense of, the sense that, instead of your mind being a discrete thing, it really is just composed of lots of different sense perceptions. And ultimately, through long meditation, that kind of dissolves in just thinking like, oh, there's the bird singing, there's a thought in my head, there's the river going by, but all those things are, as it were, on a kind of level. So there's no difference between the thoughts running through my head and the sound of the water running down the hill.
Yeah. And the way they get you to this sense of identity loss and derealization is by a sort of repeated checking, like a compulsive introspection, where you listen to your thoughts, or you try to find where you're located in your body.
I went to one group once in San Francisco where they actually started out, it was like a koan, sometimes they have these like Zen riddles, but it was just a question. And it was, what am I? So you're meant to just sit for like, I think it was a day-long retreat, sit for the whole day in silence thinking, what am I? What am I? And by the end, it does have that effect. It's weird because at first you're kind of like, well, I know what I am. I'm James. I'm this age. I live in this city. I'm studying this subject at university. By the end, you're in this state where it's like, I don't exist at all. There's just the wind and the stars, etc. Which is actually in some ways kind of a pleasant feeling. But
and it's no coincidence that that comes often with the repetition of words or phrases that cause first that semantic satiation. But then when you tie that in with a sort of, you're focusing on yourself and what you are, and it's like this repeated introspection, that you get that inhibition or that lapse of meaning whereby you lose your sense of self, in the same way as semantic satiation, compulsive checking, mirror gazing, etc.
So to bring this to bring it back to emotions, like and talking about one's feelings. So is the contention that if you obsessively talk about your feelings, you'll become dissociated from them, or they won't mean what they meant anymore through this kind of?
You can. You get that ironic uncertainty whereby if we live in such a therapized culture at this point, they call it therapy culture, where young people especially are pretty consistently encouraged to repeatedly check on themselves. They inspect themselves and their own feelings. They introspect compulsively. And I think that when you do this, it's well known in the clinical literature too, that rumination, which is a compulsive sort of introspection, usually with a negative sort of spin on it, but it's still a compulsive introspection, can contribute to anxiety disorders, depersonalization, derealization. So when young people especially are just steeped in a solution of therapy concepts where they're taught that they're supposed to perfectly be able to consciously grasp who they are, what they're feeling, how do I feel right now? I think when it's taken, especially if students are already struggling with negative emotion, and so there's a negative emotional tint to that, it seems, and I haven't done research on this, this was just a thought experiment. It seems like all of these concepts lend credence to the idea that that sort of repeated introspection could lead to a paradoxical uncertainty whereby students actually become more confused of who they are. What does it mean to be a boy? The more you think about that, I mean, you could do a meditation on that, and within half an hour, I would be confused. What does it mean to be a boy? How do I know? I feel like a boy, but what does it mean to feel like a? You can see how it could quickly result in the satiation of those concepts and the loss of that sense of what am I, who I am.
So, I mean, in some sense, it does come back to categories then, right? Because when we're thinking about an emotion, that's a category because it's distinguished from other feelings. And likewise, if you think, what does it mean to be a boy? You're distinguishing it from being a girl
or a soul, I guess.
Or a soul, as opposed to an object or something. Yeah.
And so I think there's a good, it's a good analogy anyway to sort of potentially illustrate to people why universal therapeutic interventions. I think this is a big thing. There are targeted interventions and there are universal interventions. And I think universal interventions, which has basically been the standard for like 50 years now, is we just think everyone should always be in therapy. Everyone should always be talking about their feelings. It should be in schools. Every student should be encouraged to engage in this. Mindfulness should be encouraged for it's all universally applied stuff. And I think there's actually dangers in that for iatrogenic harm. And there are some studies showing that universal mindful interventions in schools actually makes a subset of students much worse. There are case studies of people engaging in meditative practices who subsequently experience psychosis or panic attacks for like years afterwards. And it's just, so I was just sort of more trying to illustrate that this stuff isn't without dangers and it can actually make people worse. In the case of gender identity as one, I mean, you can read countless accounts from detransitioners who clearly describe this process where they're like, before I never thought about it, and once I started thinking about it a lot and ruminating, I suddenly became confused, like that sense of self. I thought about it too much and I lost the thread, and now I didn't know who I was. And they actually describe this process in pretty vivid detail. And so I was just trying to, by analogy, show how that might be possible.
Let's offer a counterpoint on the meditation front, because I've been meditating for 20 years and I think it's doing me good. But this is the good thing about free speech, because like maybe it's not. Like if I reacted to what you were saying by just being offended and shutting you down, for me that would be kind of worse, right? Because I actually want to find out if it's good for me. But anyway, what I was going to say is, you know, I always try and check things that I'm doing nowadays because it's so easy to look up research online. So like if I'm running a half marathon, I try to encourage myself by looking up, oh, there's all this literature that exercise is really good for you, which there is, I think. And same with meditation. You know, I've been looking up articles on meditation for years, not going super deep. But, and for a long time, I got the sense that there were lots of studies that suggested that meditation was good for you in various ways, often for your mental health, right? There was one I was looking at the other day about retreats and how like traditional Buddhist retreats seem to decrease anxiety. And some of those studies, I mean, I'm not a scientist like you guys, but I can tell that, you know, if they have a small n, you know, a small number of observations, then that isn't great. And some of the studies don't look amazingly well designed to me. But, you know, some of them do look better, and there are quite a lot of them by now. And so, and then those are empirical studies, right? So you're talking more about a thought experiment, then you said there's some empirical evidence of this now. So how would you put your sort of intuition on this, which I think is really interesting, against all those empirical studies of mindfulness? Actually does seem to help people in a lot of ways.
Oh, absolutely. I would never claim that it doesn't help people. And like, it's helped me. I believe it helps you. Like you seem to be doing well. Nothing is good for everyone and nothing is bad for everyone in general, especially with sort of social emotional stuff. I'm more just saying there is an avenue for this stuff when done wrong or done too much, or maybe when used in the wrong way or by certain people who are susceptible, that it can cause things to be worse, especially say young people at a vulnerable time in their life. If you have them sort of meditate on certain concepts, they can lead them to become more confused. But that doesn't mean that I think meditation or mindfulness is just bad across the board and no one should be doing it or anything like that.
It might depend on who's leading it and the context in which it's being done. And maybe there's something about Buddhist meditation as opposed to the secularized mindfulness thing, which mitigates against the harmful side.
I'm really interested. Well, okay. Well, one thing I'll say about meditation research is just like there's so many different forms of meditation, and my impression is that up to this point, like meditation research hasn't really taken enough heed of that. So they often say
Yeah.
like people just did meditation. It's like, well, what kind of meditation? You could be focusing on a physical object. You could be focusing on a visual object. You could be focusing on an extremely complicated visual object, like they do in various forms of Vajrayana or Tibetan Buddhism. You could be counting your breaths. Like you could be doing metta meditation, loving kindness meditation, where you kind of project compassion towards other beings. There's just so many different things going on in that. But one thing that really interests me about this is just the way that sort of experience of kind of ego death, the death of the soul, the experience, the feeling that you don't have a soul and you're at one with the universe. That's not only like something that can happen in Buddhist meditation. In some ways, like that is the sort of ultimate end game of Buddhist meditation. That's what people are aiming at
to maintain that state in their daily lives. Or...
Well, I don't know if they're trying to maintain the state in their daily lives, but if you think about the sort of foundational myth of Buddhism,
yeah,
in Christianity, Christ gets crucified and he sort of sacrifices himself for us. In Buddhism, Buddha sits under a tree and he reaches nibbana, in Pali, and that state is really what we're talking about. Like it's a snuffing out of the candle, right? He sort of ceases to exist in some sense. He realizes that he doesn't really exist as an individual human being. He's always been at one with everything. So it's just interesting to me how I can totally understand how that could look like depersonalization. It could be extremely disturbing for people. But then on the flip side, it's also like the basis of one of the main of the world's major religions, right?
And it's perhaps whether it's liberating or psychosis inducing might depend on a perspective on it. So if you're Gautama and you've been sitting under the Bodhi tree for 40 days and you have this realization, but behind that is all of these years of ascetic practice and reading of probably Sanskrit, Hindu scriptures, it would have been at that time. So he's got this tradition behind him already that is kind of supporting that transition. Whereas if you're some 15-year-old kid and someone's just told you to, do this mindfulness thing in the abstract, that might be quite different.
And that is stressed also in contemporary Buddhist retreats, and most of them that I've been to, that it's kind of like people have these experiences and there's a teacher there that you can go talk to about it, and you're not kind of left completely on your own. I think when people are left on their own in those situations, that scene is kind of quite irresponsible. So the idea, go on.
The point of the article was really just to lend credence by citing some interesting psychological phenomena to the idea that there is something about the human brain that you can reliably produce sense of identity loss, and very often it can be for good reasons. If you're Buddha under the tree, you lose your identity, you reach nirvana. Like it's not necessarily all negative, but there's something about the human brain that allows this phenomenon to happen. Something about the mechanisms of our neurons or whatever it is. And then I was just pointing out that this may explain why people who tend to think about their gender a lot or think about their feelings too much or ruminate come to be confused, because it's a reliable mechanism in the human brain that can have negative or positive consequences.
No, it's a really good point. I'm glad you brought it up.
It explains a relevant phenomenon in the wider culture going on.
This is the thing. I'm glad you brought it up, especially because I'm someone who's interested in Buddhist meditation and I'm interested in mental health and things like that, because and this is why I like free speech. Like I think these subjects are important, and therefore I want to have as many views as possible that I can actually consider, and I can look at the evidence for them and make sure that we're getting this right.
On another take on this idea of whether it's good to talk about your emotions and express your emotions openly and so on, I read an article the other day by Mary Harrington. I don't know if you know who she is. She writes.
I love Mary. Yeah,
she's great. She's. Yeah. I suppose you'd call her a conservative feminist or something like that. I don't know. But anyway, she wrote this article about. It's good that men repress their emotions, and what she meant was when men have been exhorted to talk about their feelings, very often it's been by women who think that their feelings will be kind of feminine feelings, and they'll express all this sadness and grief, and they'll be vulnerable. But actually, Mary Harrington was saying, well, men have these quite violent ideas and fantasies, and probably it's good if they don't actually express those in the world. And I think some of us as men may have had the experience not of hopefully acting out our more lurid fantasies, but just expressing our true emotions, which may be more angry than sad sometimes and more aggressive than vulnerable. And really, that's not what's wanted. That's not what we're being asked to do, right?
I don't know if Mary Harrington goes into this, but there's also a problem for men of like, women nowadays say they want men to be emotional, to open up and to cry easily or readily, and that's not necessarily what women find attractive, and that's a different thing. And
Yes,
it's almost
that,
like the ideology is so strong that they can't admit to themselves that's
that
often the
too.
case. Maybe it's not the case for everyone,
But
but it's a tendency. But
Harrington's point is that if men were to truly express their emotions and their feelings and let it all hang out,
women would just be horrified.
They'd be, not only would women be horrified, our civilization would be at risk.
I don't know about that, but
well, if it goes far enough, it is, because then you start to have,
there is a difference between like expressing and talking about it and actually kind of going along with it, right?
There's a difference.
Indulging.
But
there's a difference between expressing and indulging.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I mean, that's true as well. And you can say, well, I suppose that's right. But the thing is that you need a fair degree of self-control to be able to, like, if you're really bloody angry about something and you're asked to express it, then unless you have quite a degree of self-control, that's going to come out as pretty aggressive, right? There is a way of doing it where you are consciously trying to keep a handle on the external expression and just verbally say what you're feeling. But again, that may be more of a feminine thing than a masculine thing a lot of the time, because women have greater verbal facility than men on average. And you know what I'm saying? It's I think there is a good reason why men keep a handle on their kind of darker emotions and don't like to put them out there.
That's the Chesterton's fence argument for chivalry and stuff, is that a lot of society and culture was built around the idea that a lot of male instincts need to be men need to be taught how to constrain their instincts.
We need to discipline ourselves.
I don't know if you guys saw, there's a really interesting article came out, I think it was maybe a month or so ago now, investigating whether training people to simply repress their bad feelings or suppress them rather than indulge them or mindfulness them.
I saw it on the Brandon X feed. Yeah, excellent article.
Oh, did I post that? Did I? Yeah. So there's actually some research out there showing that actually, if you, rather than train people to again indulge and sort of really process and consciously process their negative emotions, if you train people to just sort of suppress those negative emotions and understand that very often your feelings aren't valid or your feelings are somewhat pathological or not based in reality, and if you train people to suppress those and try and change their perspective on things, it actually does has efficacy for improving mental well-being, and that runs counter to the sort of therapeutic model of mental health.
There's an interesting thing a few years ago. I think it was the American Psychological Association or whatever it's called put out this big document, and it was 2020 to 2021, so it was highly ideological. And one of the things it was saying is that people have to express their feelings more, and they shouldn't. Repression is always bad. And I remember Steven Pinker wrote a response to it, and one of the interesting points he made was just this idea that repression is bad is just dogma. It may be true in some cases. Like I think there probably is evidence for it in some cases, but it's obviously not true that repressing your emotions is bad in every situation, because we do it all the time, right? Like we're constantly repressing our emotions in ways that if we didn't do it, we would just all be kind of crazy, right? Like imagine you're sort of mad at your boss today or something, obviously you're not just going to go straight to his office and say, I'm mad at you today, and sometimes you annoy me, and maybe you'll find a way of productively bringing it up later or something. But maybe you're really mad at your partner, or you just feel kind of angry that day. Why would the advice be to sort of just get really mad at her and like curse her and stuff, rather than just to kind of maybe you're going to channel it in another direction, but obviously you're going to repress it to some extent, right?
And another example of that, which I came across in the 1990s when I was at Melbourne University, there was a woman there who was working with Vietnam War veterans, and she was strongly of the view that it was a bad idea unless you really knew what you were doing to encourage these guys to revisit their experiences in the war, because it would re-traumatize them, to use a modern parlance, and in fact she believed that it could lead to suicide. And there's a reason why veterans don't talk about what happened, and especially with people who can't possibly understand because they weren't there. And if they are going to talk about them, it's going to be with one another. Because
isn't it true that there's good evidence that like the way that they actually treat PTSD most successfully is some kind of controlled exposure?
Yes, and she would have said that. So I said, unless you know what you're doing, and that's the knowing what you're doing part there. It's got to be, kind of, first of all, voluntary. You can't coerce someone to do it, and also you've got to approach it slowly. And you need somebody who can hear those things without flinching, and have some idea of a way to respond that means that the person who's talking to you knows that you get it. Because otherwise, if it feels like it's just being cast into the void, they're just expressing it, and then there's nothing to reflect it back. And I think that's why a lot of war veterans will only talk about their experiences with other veterans.
Mm. Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
All right. So one
Yeah.
final thing I wanted to talk about. It's my understanding that one of the ways that you deal with mental health is make yourself feel better and get in touch with the universe and all that is to go out into the countryside and shoot animals. So you're a hunter apparently. I know from your social media. So yeah,
Yeah,
just talk about that. I'm interested because I've gone hunting once and I didn't shoot anything. My friend did. But it's
yeah,
a world that I have like virtually no contact with. I know it's huge in New Zealand, and this is actually seen across the world as like a great place to go hunting. So, do you just want to talk about
yeah.
that?
Yeah, New Zealand is one of the best places to go hunting because all of our game animals, our edible game animals, are pest species. So there's no seasons, there's no bag limits. You can just go whenever you want. But the way I got into hunting was my granddad actually was a hunter. He was very poor, and so he used hunting as a way to feed his family. He would go out and shoot deer and bring home the meat and stuff like that. They were so poor that they had a little batch on the back of a farm, and the farmer would let them go out and pick through the parsnips after the cows had been through eating them as sort of a supplementary feed. Him and his mum would go out and pick out the parsnips that the cows had missed. So he grew up very poor, and because of that, he would hunt for meat. And my dad did a little bit of it, but he got out of it until me and my brothers got back into it. I got back into it during undergrad when I was very poor, and my brother was a hunter and he got me into it. So I would go out. I spent my whole undergrad, I essentially ate only wild venison because I was very poor
Wow.
and it was just a free source of meat for me. I would feed
Where were you
myself. I
living
learned
when you
to
were in undergrad?
Palmerston North.
Okay, so it's interesting because I mean, we've all had experience of the sort of university milieu at the moment, and my
Yeah.
sense is that actually hunting isn't that popular among academics, at least in
Or
Wellington,
students.
or students. So
No,
how does that go down? Do you talk about it? Is there like a hunting club on campus or what?
this is recent. There's a hunting club on campus, which I'm actually helping out with now. I'm one of the sort of executives or whatever of the club. But throughout my undergrad, I didn't talk about it too much because you would offend people and people would get quite upset, despite the fact that they themselves eat meat.
This
They
is a
they
thing that
find it.
I find incredibly hypocritical. I'm a
Yeah.
vegetarian.
Oh
Well, I'm
yeah, yeah.
almost a vegetarian. I eat
Yep.
fish. And the reason that I eat
Oh
fish
yeah.
is because I'm prepared to kill a fish. So I
Yeah.
eat what I'm prepared to kill. Uh,
Exactly. And that's sort
and
of the
and
way
so I
I
have
look at it.
endless respect for hunters because they're
Yeah.
honest about what they're doing and what they're eating.
Actually, I will say yes. So the way I got into hunting partly was I'm horrified by like factory farming. Like I would watch the documentaries and just almost pull my hair out. Like this is insane what we're doing. So I tried to be a vegan for a long time. Close to a year probably. I was tinkering with my diet, trying to be vegan, vegetarian, and it just never worked for me. I'll spare you the details, but my digestive system was not in good shape. I
Right.
just I couldn't handle it. I don't know why, what it is about me, but it just did not fit with my body. I was working in horticulture at the time, full time, and I was just constantly tired, constantly hungry. I could never be full, and then I had all sorts of other issues going on. And my brother was a hunter, so that's partly why I was like, well, if I'm going to hunt, or if I'm going to eat meat, sorry, I'm going to shoot something that dies in about 10 seconds and has spent its entire life out in the mountains in the sun, grazing its own food, mating females, or
Yeah.
living an animal's life. So that's what I did, and I eventually became quite good at butchering. Like I make all my own sausages. I provide all my grandparents and my siblings with sausages and meat and stuff like that. But after a while, yeah, it became something really important to like my my self-concept and my mental health in a strange way. Um, it's something about the alienation, postmodern sort of alienation from nature that we all
Yeah.
experience working in offices and living in houses. You never get to see this. You barely see the stars from one day to the next. Um, you don't really interact with nature in the way that we evolved to interact with nature. You go on a hike from time to time, and that can assuage that sort of need. But there's something about hunting for me that that meets some sort of atavistic need.
Yeah. It's
Um,
extremely primal. What you need to do
yeah,
now is get good with a spear. Put you down the
yeah,
side and do it
yeah,
the real man's way.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
That
it's
it's
so
hard
interesting.
to it's hard enough to get close to them as it is, though. I don't know how.
What you
But
guys
it sorry.
I just want to say what you said a few minutes ago about factory farming. That was exactly the experience I had. This is back when I was in San Francisco. Again, I was watching a documentary about factory farming. Specifically, I remember like pigs in cages.
Mm,
Like
Oh yeah,
half a dozen pigs
yeah.
in the same cage, and they kind of like
Oh
had to crap it through the cage and stuff. And
oh yeah.
I
Makes
just had this emotional. I couldn't even tell you. I couldn't even articulate exactly what the sort of emotional response was, but I just felt
yeah,
sort of yuck. And I
yeah,
actually became a vegetarian for a few years, or a pescatarian. And I had the same
yeah.
experience as you, where I was just, well, I started doing triathlon around the same time. Maybe wasn't a good
Mm,
idea. And I was just
yeah,
incredibly tired. I mean, I knew
yeah.
I was going to be tired because I was doing triathlon, but I was
Mm,
more tired than you're supposed to be, I think. And I went to the doctor, and sure enough, he was like, "Oh, you're anemic." So I started taking iron
mm,
pills. But then the iron pills didn't really sort of suit my stomach, and
yeah,
and I read all this stuff about how actually your body is evolved to get iron out of meat, and it doesn't work
yeah.
so well with pills. So I thought, okay, I'll
yeah.
eat meat like once a month, and then soon enough it became like once a week. It's still around
Mm,
like once or twice a week. I don't tend to cook meat at home, but
yeah.
yeah,
It is an
There's some.
individual physiology thing. I mean, it's never been an issue for me.
Mm,
But people are different in this way. I
mm,
don't get tired. I'm not anemic. Um, I,
yeah. You have an enviable constitution though. You drink coffee, you drink long
it
blacks
must be the coffee.
late at night,
That's
and
where I
then
get
you
my iron. I'm sure.
yeah,
Yes,
you don't
lots
have
of
yeah.
problem
iron and
sleeping,
coffee. Not.
which is
Yeah.
weird.
I read a lot about the disenchantment of postmodern life, and like there's various writers out there who talk about ways to sort of bring re-enchantment and sort of like imbue our lives with meaning. Uh, there's certain areas of our lives that have no sort of like deeper meaning now. You go to the store and you just buy your food off the shelf. You don't know where it's from. If you waste some, whatever, it took you 2 minutes to get it from the store. You never saw the animal that died anyway. There's this
Yeah.
lack of meaning and connection with so many different aspects of our lives. And when I hunt and when I shoot a deer, like I often feel hard. Actually, for a while there, every time I shot a deer, I thought this is the last one. Like I think I'm going to have to quit hunting. I get very, I get guilt ridden, and I feel very bad. But when you go and you touch the animal and it's still warm, and you have this weird moment where you're like, I've kind of done something that's very confronting to me as a post modern like suburban human. But then you feel that gratitude, and as you butcher the animal, you become aware that you're the same thing. Like I hold a deer's heart in my hand and I can feel my own heart beating. And I'm like, I'm
Right.
literally, you have this sense of awareness that you are similarly just a fleshy thing. One day you're going to die and something's going to eat you, whether even if it's just bacteria, you'll be consumed by something one day. And it just connects you to like the natural world in a way that nothing else does. And then
Kind
when
of
you
goes
take
back to what we were talking about before, doesn't it? With ego death and a sense
yeah,
that you're a part of everything.
yeah. And then you take the food home and you eat it and you think about the animal, you think about the effort you put into it, and it just brings a level of meaning into an aspect of your life that for many people and for many of us has become quite meaningless. And I don't know. I've been working on verbalizing it properly and maybe writing some essays about it, but it's a hard thing to verbalize.
I think
But
you
it,
did it
it
beautifully right
definitely
So
then.
so do I. And I know what you mean because you know I haven't done it for a while, but I used to go fishing a lot, and I had the same
yeah,
sense. I didn't ever enjoy killing the fish, but I
yeah,
had a hard rule that as soon as I pulled it out of the water, I had to you know put it out of its misery, and
yeah,
that was a moment of decisive violence against the fish and taking its life, and that
yeah,
was always a hard moment.
yeah,
But then yes, cutting it up and preparing
yeah,
it, and you do get that sense of
yeah.
I know exactly what you're
There's some
talking
good
about.
psychological literature written about how hunting can actually be strangely an anachronistic way of reminding people that human systems and natural systems are not separate. They're coupled systems and they rely on each other. And they think that one of the ways to actually improve people's responsiveness to various sort of environmental policies is if they had that sort of first-hand connection with the environment, they'd be much more aware of the interconnected nature of sort of human and natural systems, um, and that it would alleviate that alienation from both our labor and our consumption that that most postmodern people experience.
I think you found a way of selling this to the university types. That sounded
I've
perfect.
actually, it's a dream of mine, actually. I would love to be able to get some funding, and I've been racking my brain to think of some way to study this and sort of do some research in this area, because it's an area I'm passionate about. But so far I haven't been able to think of any research program that I could use. But it would be.
I'm sure the Marsden Fund will come your way with a grant.
Oh yeah, that was a bit of a. That was
Love how
a
everyone
nice
just identified that as a joke immediately.
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but yeah, this whole hunting, and I'm also a territorial army soldier. I'm in the territorial force, which is like the reserve force. So all of this stuff does make me, I don't know, I'm a rare bird in the academy, somewhat out of place. Yeah.
Well, we hope you don't get shot.
Long may you survive there.
To continue the metaphor. Yeah. But thanks so much for coming on today. We know it can
Awesome.
people can have a little bit of trepidation when they first come on a Dangerous Ideas podcast or whatever, but we're grateful for you for coming on, and that's been a great conversation. So
has indeed. Thank you, mate.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm a listener of the show, so it's good to be here. Cheers.